Whatever emerges quickly, spontaneously, reveals your character when you're given such questions. Do they remind you in our own age of certain types of questions that might be asked you? Koans. Buddhist koans. And therefore, there's quite a similarity between the two. Now, what do you do then with these? You memorize them. You memorize these patterns, these words. Right? You memorize them. You put them in your head. You internalize them. You go over them again and again and again. Because the belief was, and certainly it's true today and advertising proves it, that at some point with these antidotes you'll internalize it and then you'll act in view of the very things that you're memorizing. There's a very close relationship, therefore, between what you've been taught, what you internalize, and how you behave. Therefore, there's a whole group of people living at this point from 200 BC, at this point I'm talking about to 200 AD, where what they want to do is model themselves of the characters of their choice. Ah, the models. They get models. Ideals. Ideals. Well, obviously there's a great chance there for rhetoric to come and play a major role, which it did at this time. The schools of rhetoric were very famous at this time. There's a well-known school in Tyre that St. Paul attended. There are several great thinkers who were reported to have lived in the town of Gadara at the time of Jesus, which was a famous school of rhetoric, where they taught this kind of thing. And most especially, they taught something which I think was most interesting. You must find the right words, you must find the right words for the right speech to impress the person so that they in turn will internalize it and they will act in conformity with what it is. Models behavior. And this, of course, is the ideal of rhetoric, turning speech into character. That then brings a certain lifestyle appropriate to it. Now, Seneca is the chap I enjoy of all of these people, and you'll soon see why. Seneca was very worried about this, first, second century. He said you must always be careful about what you reproduce in yourself, because you'll become like the author of whoever it is that you're memorizing. And therefore, he had great cautions about this. He said, what you must do is that you must always make sure it's the appropriate, the proper sage, the proper words. Even though they are very cleverly constructed, you must be very careful, because they are going to then bring about a change in your character, and accordingly you'll act in view of that, and therefore you should be very careful about who you choose as your model and the words you use. Now, this internalizing, of course, is the great game in the Greek world. This is ethos. This is ethos. Right? Culturalization, right? This is what you do. This is how you generate men. This is how you generate an ideal. That ideal then is able to bring into existence the best of the words, the best of the actions that people are said to have performed or involved in. You bring them together. Many schools existed at this time for this primary purpose. This is really the culturalization of early period that we're talking about now. What is it? This is the psychology. This is basically a psychology of the Stoic. This is what it is. Now, there's a problem here. Let's look at the problem. Another group of thinkers came along and said, you can never, in principle, ever solve this problem. Once you assume this, you're caught in a bind because you're raising a puzzle which you can never resolve, because the premise you're proceeding by is in principle incapable of solution. You cannot solve this particular problem. What's the problem? The problem is resemblance. How can you in any way be sure that there's a resemblance between the image you have in your mind and the objects in the external world? How can you be sure of that? You can't touch it because that's nothing other than a message going to the brain. This is really saying man is an ego in a bag of skin. Tightly wrapped. There is no exit. No exit. You can't get out of your mind. You can't get out of your mind to see anything. You can't confirm that these are similar. There's no way you can determine that there's any resemblance between these two. What's worse than that is that this view holds to this notion, and it's a very, very fine notion, and you can generate a very beautiful question out of it. If this is true, if there is a resemblance between these two, and you experience things in your mind or in your brain, some people like brain, though you don't hear in the ear, you hear in the mind, you don't hear in the brain, but let's leave that. This is primarily the problem of the fact that if you're making a claim that you experience these things, an impression of these things in your mind, then if you look at this blackboard, you know that there's a boundary around it. You know if there's a picture that there's a boundary around the picture. If there's a fish bowl that has some fish in it, you know if you see the fish, you also see the water in the bowl. If you make the claim that you see something in something, then you should have a separate perception of this and have a clear perception that these things are in it. And therefore everybody here should therefore be able to come in immediate contact with your own mind. This is the basic problem with this kind of psychology. It's the basic problem of Stoic philosophy. And in the modern age, this came back with David Hume and empiricists. This is basically the empiricist's dilemma, as it's sometimes called. Empiricists, David Hume, Stoics, they all agree to one thing. Thou shalt not go beyond apprehensive representation. You should never go beyond the impression created in the mind. For the further you go, you're going into empty abstractions. Now, how does this relate to Q? How does this relate to Thomas, the Gospel of Thomas? Thomas and Q emerged very clearly. You can look at the doctrine of Q, and Q, as you probably know, are the sayings of Jesus. An analysis shows that those sayings of Jesus can be, by a very interesting and careful argument, to predate any of the Gospels, especially the Gospel of Mark, which is, depending upon who you read, somewhere between 70 and the end of the century. Usually 75, by the way.